Can you hear us okay out there? Or is this... Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you go in like this.
Then I'll take it up a notch. Yeah. All right, that'll be the good universal sign.
We feel like visitors to our own home.
This is on. We are videotaping today because we want to capture the history of when this was a farm. And we have the great good fortune of having with us two of the families, of the three families that took care of this property in the 1900s, before it became a park in 1990. So, my name is Karen Green, and I am the very amateur historian who is fascinated with the history of the park. And today's activities, I think everybody knows, are organized by the Friends of Quiet Waters Park. And I hope all of you are involved. There's all kinds of great committees. I'm on the environmental committee not because I know anything about the environment, but because they are doing an interpretive signage project. And the former superintendent said, hey, we could use some interpretive signs about history. So I'm learning about the environment, and the environmentalists are learning about history. So as you may know, the Friends of Quiet Waters Park organize lots of things here. Festivals like this. The next one coming up is the Fairy Festival in May, and there will be like 75 or 80 gorgeous little vignettes, that have been built, and you can walk along the Hollow Trail to see those. The arts festivals in the fall, sculpture, all kinds of things. So do join if you're not part. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves with their names, what ages they lived here, or in Chris's case didn't, but and where they lived, what building in the park, and what role they had, child of, or just their connections to the park. Okay, so Bill, I'd like to start with you.
Okay, all right. My name is Bill Buser. This is my wife, Torrey.
It's louder.
Sorry. And we met in college, and when we graduated in our senior year, Torrey, well, she was from D.C. We got married, graduated from college, and then we both came to live here on the farm, which was quite a culture shock from somebody who was from Washington, D.C. She knew what tomato plants were. She didn't know what the impact of 500 tomato plants would be on her life. But in any case, I'm born and raised in Annapolis. My parents, my father had worked on the farm since the mid-1930s. When he got married, he brought his wife, Margaret, to live here on the farm with him. My sister was 8 years older. She was born and raised on this farm. And I was born in 1951, and I was raised on this farm. I went away to college for 4 years, came back from college to take over as being the farm manager, state manager, along with my wife, Torrey. So we were here approximately about a year. And having both been college graduates, we knew that we weren't going to be here for the rest of our lives. This was not a career for us. This was a stopping off place before we moved on. But we were very appreciative of the opportunity from Miss Parker, to live here and help take care of the farm. So
Great.
that's something.
Thanks. And Chris?
So my name is Chris Buser. I am obviously the son of Bill and Torrey Buser, and my grandparents, Bill and Margaret. While I was born shortly after everyone left the farm, The farm has been, kind of an important part of the family history, something I've grown up with. It was never referred to as the park, it was always the farm. And so, being able to come down here when it opened, being down here with my grandparents and my parents, going to ice skating, when I was a young child. When my grandmother was older and I was able to drive her around, we would come down here to the visitor center and sit up in the restaurant, and she would tell stories, and we would drive around and she would point out, different places on the farm and what happened in different locations, what life was like down here. So I guess you can call me a sort of amateur historian, if you will, of the park, and family enthusiast, of it.
Great, and you, Frank?
I'm Frank Dulaney. I came here with my parents. I was in college at the time. They actually stayed at what I now know is the farmhouse right here. My brother-in-law became the caretaker here. He moved here in '73. And my parents lived in Eastport, right on Wells Cove, right on the water. They decided when my dad retired that they wanted to move somewhere else closer to Hillsmere. And so Miss Parker and Mr. Young, who was with Miss Parker, said, the farmhouse is available. Why don't you just move to the farmhouse? So my brother-in-law said, well, listen, your dad's retired now. Why don't you come and live on the farm and help out with the mowing and things around the house? And I said, that's fine. I'm just getting out of college. I bought a piece of land in Hillsmere to build. That was in like 75, 76. There was a delay in putting sewage in at Hillsmere. And so I ended up getting married, wanted to move into the house with my new bride. It was delayed, but we stayed here for probably about another year when they finally opened up permits. We moved to Hillsmere in '79. There was a big blizzard here in '79. It was in February, I believe.
Yeah.
From the farmhouse down to the gate was a mile. So my brother-in-law and I,
A mile.
A
a mile, I'm sorry. My brother-in-law and I had to plow to get out. We had a tractor and I guess it was almost like a backhoe with a blade on it. It took us probably 8 hours to get down, and it was like 5 degrees that day. We finally got in to the gate, and we were the first ones out, so we said, what we'll do is go over to a high store that was in the shopping center. I think it's a Pizza Bowley's now. And we rode up on the tractor, and you talk about feeling like we were farmhands going in there, but we needed to get milk and all that because we had been on the farm for probably 4 days. So we finally got out, came back, and that was probably the only time I did not like being on the farm because it was such a long trip to get there. But we finally got out, and things turned out very well after that.
Oh, thanks, Frank. And Chris, you're, like you said, an amateur historian. How about if you tell folks who are the people that we're mentioning? Who were the bishops?
Sure.
Who was Mary Parker, and what was their role, starting from when your granddad came to work here?
Sure. Well, my grandfather came to work here in the mid-1930s, and at that time the farm was actually owned by Truxton Beale and his wife. Truxton Beale was he was a former minister to Persia from the United States. His family was also related to the Truxton Park in Annapolis. It's named after his uncle. And he died in 1936. And then his widow sold the property to the bishops, Edward and Lillian Bishop, in June of 1938. At that time, it was a working dairy farm. My grandfather was managing the dairy farm at that point. It's a few months before he winds up marrying my grandmother. And the bishops bought it, not to become farmers. The bishops were far from farmers. They were in their 40s at the time, and they bought this to be their summer place. They had their main residence down in Bradenton, Florida. They did not have any children, but when they would travel from Bradenton up to Annapolis, they did not come alone. They would travel with their private nurse, their private physician. They had cooks, butlers, maids, and Mr. Bishop, being a yachtsman, he would have his yacht crew who would stay here. So there was always, folks who were traveling with them. The private nurse that I mentioned, her name was Mary Parker. She had met the Bishops in the mid-1930s, fresh out of nursing school, and became their live-in nurse. She would remain very tight with them for the rest of their lives, and she would ultimately go on to inherit Quiet Waters and other properties down in Florida and other such things. Was a lifetime companion, for them. The Bishops met when they were kids. They actually grew up on the same street as one another. This is probably not the same type of street that you and I grew up on. Their other neighbor was John D. Rockefeller. So it's starting to tell you a little bit about their family money. Mrs. Bishop's grandfather had been an executive with Standard Oil with Mr. Rockefeller. In later life, she would talk and tell stories about how she would ride horses with the Rockefellers. Mr. Bishop, he grew up on the same street, probably not in as big a house. He wasn't as wealthy as Mrs. Bishop was. Her maiden name was Huntington. But his father was the vice president of Standard Welding, which was an offshoot of Standard Oil. So plenty of money went around. And he was really more of a yachtsman and businessman, Mr. Bishop was. And so they found this as an opportunity to invest in property. They bought it for $75,000 in 1938, which today translates to $1.6 million. I think $1.6 million is a great deal for Quiet Waters. If a couple of you want to go in, we can maybe buy it back, and I'll give you 100. You take 100 acres, and I'll take the last 100, and it'll be a great thing.
Yeah.
So, it started to convert very quickly from a working dairy farm into more of an estate at that point. And so my grandfather went from being more of a dairy manager to an estate manager, but still a working farm.
And Bill, you grew up here with your dad through that whole transition. You were born here and all of that. Can you talk about what it was like in the 50s and 60s for you?
Yes. Mr. Bishop had set things up so that when he purchased the property, and again, he was not a farmer, and he offered my dad, he said, look, since you know the place, why don't you leave that company and come work to me and just take care of the place? And my dad said, sure, great. I'll give you a house, no utilities, and I'll give you a small income. And Mr. Bishop says, I'm not interested in making a profit. He said, do not make a profit. But he said, don't fire anybody, don't get rid of anything. But he says, as things wind down over the years, then just do that. So in the 50s, as I was growing up, I was born again in 1951, we had maybe 2,000 chickens. We would always raise 25 to 30 turkeys from hatchlings every year so that our family would have lots of turkeys for around Christmas and Thanksgiving. Those were our Christmas gifts. Here, have a turkey, have a turkey. Cheap gifts. We still had, as a young child, we still had 3 of the original draft horses, Nellie, George, and I think the other one was called Queenie. 2 of them died when I was very young, but George lasted until I was, probably in my mid-teens. So, it was a long time. And again, we never fired anybody. So there were many buildings and homes, like where you came into the gate. Well, there was a little house up there called the Little White House, the little house. And again, that's where a husband and wife and maybe their kids would live. The wife would work in the houses and the gentleman would work in the fields taking care of the place. They were never let go. They were allowed to live there until they decided on their own, to leave. So he was a very generous person, and that's the terms which my father took on board. So in the 50s, we still had a lot of animals. Most of the fields were planted in corn. It was essential for the animals. We still had cows. Grew a lot of soy. Some of the fields were left in grass so that they could be, if you walk down, you can see some of the old farm equipment, like the old rake. Well, you would sit on top of that rake, and it was pulled by a team of horses, and then every so many yards, once it had a full bale of hay or grass, you'd hit a pedal, the rake would flip up and dump all the straw right there on the ground. And so you'd make long rows of all this, straw, and then you'd have to come along again with a wagon and some of the people who lived on the farm with pitchforks, and you'd start piling onto the wagon, and then the wagon would come to the barns, which was right where you're standing or sitting right now. This was all a stable and barn complex with silos, storage. The main section could milk as many as 50 or 60 head of cattle at a time. So if you were to come into the main doors of where the dairy was, where the cows were being milked, the first thing you'd have to do is put on these great big huge boots all the way up to your belt just about. You'd have to go through sprayers to get everything hosed down before you were allowed to walk into that area. That was sterilization in those days. It probably wasn't very sterile by today's standards, but yeah, everything was, still in place.
Great, and Torrey, how about you? What was your perception coming from DC to here and seeing for example, your mother-in-law's life on the farm? What was it like for her? What was it like for you to make this kind of transition?
When Margaret, Bill's mother, used to, say she came down here, she was a nurse in town for a while, and then she came down here, and she helped what was ever needed. Like if the bishops called and they said they were coming up, she had to strip all the beds, do all the linens, iron everything, get everything ready for them. Their butlers and maids came up right before they came, a couple days before they arrived, but everything had to be prepared. And as many of you know, in the 40s and 50s, there were no conveniences as there are nowadays, so everything was done by hand. And she loved it. Both her family and her husband's family were from Annapolis, so she went to Annapolis Elementary when she was growing up and everything. So they were very used to this area. They had family that would come all the time, which made it, I think, it was home. It was just home for them. And she enjoyed it. She loved it. I grew up where houses were 20 feet apart from each other, if that much, and you always saw neighbors, and you were never alone. And somebody was always watching you. And then I came down here and I lived on top of the black-car garage that was down by the river. And it was 2 miles out to the gate. It was nobody around. And I was like, what do you do all day? I didn't know about farming. The first summer we were here, they told me that, they were planting this garden and I needed to go get containers and ball jars for canning. And I got a case. Thought that was good. Coming from DC, I had no idea. But they also planted 500 tomato plants that year, much less all the string beans and everything else. So needless to say, I was overwhelmed. I learned a lot about canning immediately.
And how many cans to buy?
Yeah, a lot more jars. But it was a wonderful, people came all the time to visit you because it's such a beautiful place to come. If they knew you, like, well, we're going down to see the Busers today, and they'd come down, and friends had boats, and we'd go out down the water, and it was a beautiful place to start our lives together.
How long did it take you to adjust to the change from DC to the farm? Did you just accept it right away? Or
I had to. I was here, and you make the best out of what you have. And I taught in Anne Arundel County. I was a kindergarten teacher at the time. So I made friends, and it became home. Yeah.
And Frank, I know you were a bit older, but you had a pile of siblings, and they grew up here. What was it like for children? Talk about your family and how many people could fit in that farmhouse? You have how many siblings?
Well, we had 6 kids. There were 4 sisters and a brother. My brother and I actually lived here on the farm. he lived here probably until he was out of college. I actually moved here, or moved from here, I would say it was probably about the mid-70s. I had just gotten out of college, as I said before, and wanted to build a house in Hillsmere. And that was delayed somewhat, but at the same time, I was able to come back periodically to help my dad. I remember where we're sitting now, this was a long field from the main house, where I always call it the main house, but it's the farmhouse, cutting the grass. And it would take 5 hours
To cut the
to
grass.
cut the grass in front of the farmhouse and down this way and on the other side. And that was with like a 5-foot sweep on the tractor. And
Gets
so it
boring
was-
after a while, doesn't it?
Yes, and your mind would wander. It was on autopilot, just going down, making strips going down. The only time I remember not liking cutting the grass, I ran into some ground bees
Oh,
and didn't know where they were, where I'd hit them, but they came and they attacked. And I pushed a button to stop, and I jumped off the tractor and just started getting rid of them. And then I looked around and I said, well, I don't know where they are. I'm gonna have to start back up. And I got in the tractor again, started back up and went on up. And then I talked to my brother-in-law, and he said, well, what you have to do is, he said, you've got to get rid of them because they're not going anywhere. And I said, okay, well, he said, take some gasoline, find the hole, and put it in there. So I had a little Volkswagen, and I drove around. I found where they were swarming. I went and put some gasoline in there and just watched. And eventually, I didn't have to worry about them anymore. Didn't have to worry about any more ground bees. But that was an experience that I don't wish on anybody, because you didn't know what to do. I was worried about the tractor, so as I said, I just had to stop it and jump off and just wait to find out what the next step was to get back on the tractor.
It was a critical decision because you had to decide, because it takes a few seconds to stop a tractor.
Yes.
You
Yes,
gotta
it
take
did.
off, you gotta stop the mower, you gotta stop the tractor, and you gotta
Yeah.
jump off the thing. Do I do that and run, or do I just make my escape on the tractor and, hope that they don't follow me for a while?
Yeah, you didn't know where they were.
Yeah, because you didn't know where they were. So I would do either one. Either way, you were going to get lit up.
Right.
You were going to get stung.
Cutting for hay, or was this just?
No,
like a
just to level
state
the
law?
grass, just the grass.
When I was growing up, we cut for hay. Well, not for hay, for straw. There's a difference. We were cutting for straw. Hay we purchased. But later on, we were just cutting for cosmetic reasons.
Right.
So when my dad would say, Billy boy, it's time, cut fields, okay, next 2 weeks, you're gonna be doing two things. You're gonna be maintaining the tractor so that you can spend 8 hours a day cutting fields. That's what you did, and like you said,
Yeah.
you just mindlessly, you just start to daydream about fishing or whatever.
How many what?
Acres.
Well, you mean where I
The
cut?
farm.
Oh, the farm was what, 330 acres?
Yeah.
I think, something like that. And this area that I cut was probably 5 or 6 acres of it. Where the main farmhouse was, it was a hill going down. So I remember balancing on the tractor, having to lean on one side so you wouldn't go over, because you didn't want to go down because it was so hard to stop the
Right.
tractor, so you went sideways.
Couldn't stop it.
Yeah.
So where was this is the farmhouse that
Yes.
in this picture, and where was that located?
the visitor center,
Ah.
the farm,
Right.
yeah, and this is where
Right.
the barns were. And then, maybe, now your sister married,
Bucky Mitchell,
Bucky
who was the
Mitchell.
caretaker down at the, I got like the 5-car garage. That's where they lived above that.
The newer part of the property that has recently come to, 18 acres over there, and that was Mary Parker's. And you all may know that Mary Parker, the park opened in 1990, but Mary Parker didn't pass away until age 108. And so that remaining piece of property that was in 2020, I believe.
So,
And,
Want me to take it?
and that remaining property just came to the park now.
So this used to be, this is the old farmhouse?
Right.
But where
Where
right
the
in front of
visitors
the, right in front.
Did the old farmhouse have all that brick landscaping out there, or was that Quiet Waters that put that in?
Quiet water.
That was,
So here, I'll pass these around so you can. So this is the old farmhouse. It's sat really on the other side of the current visitor center. So right where the blue heron statue is overlooking the ice skating rink and pond. And it was oriented in such that it actually faced Hillsmere. So I'll pass that around and take a look.
The orientation is kind of confusing because I was telling Frank, the farmhouse was built, the front of the farmhouse actually faced back towards all the stables and barns, which is where we are.
So the front of the farmhouse faced the barns
Yeah,
here?
that would have been,
Back here, yeah.
yeah, that would have been the front of the farmhouse.
Yeah.
We were facing the productive part of the farm. The back side of the farmhouse is where the visitor center faces. But again, the purpose in the 50s and 40s and 30s was different. So that's why it seems turned around to us now, but in reality, at the time, that's what made perfect sense.
So talk to us about the other buildings that were over in the 18 acres. So there was the 5-car garage where you lived above.
Yes.
And, yeah, and then what about the other buildings over there?
Okay. Right now, where the dog park is, if you were in the dog park and you were to start heading over towards where the gazebos were, there was a large 2-story building there. It was called the gardener's house. Why do you think it was called the gardener's house? Main gardener and his family all lived there. And as a kid, it had just been vacated. So I don't know who the people were that lived in there, but their name wasn't Gardner. But they had been some of the remnants, and they lived in that structure. And it was a big home. I mean, these weren't, for the most part, these were not little shanties. These were, respectable, sizable homes. Just beyond where the ranger's house is now, if you were to go down a little further, there was another beautiful old home, again, 2 stories, great big porch out in the front. In those days, it had a huge wooden stove. There was no electricity down there at the time, plus a 2-car garage. And so right now, where you see some of the old antique pieces of furniture, there was actually a large home with a separate 2-car garage right next to it. That is what Frank said they used to call it the farmhouse. That is not the farmhouse. Mr. Bishop would roll over his grave.
Big house that was
That is
all the way on the end.
Yeah, that's the big house.
That overlooked the water.
That was the bishops lived, and Miss Parker lived.
Right. Yeah. Now, during my college years, I would live in that house during the summers and on my vacations because the bishops wanted somebody to be in the house. They were very concerned about security.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
So
what they wanted.
I took one of the back bedrooms, which had a full bath. Didn't have any hot water, but I didn't care because we turned the hot water off.
So I want to ask Chris a question about, you've already heard, a really big change from when it was a dairy farm and Bill's father was
Yeah.
farming to the estate. And one of the reasons, the main reasons Bill referred to was just letting the farm wind down. But it was more than that. There was a reason. Can you talk about Mrs. Bishop's attitude toward animals?
Sure. So Mrs. Bishop, as I mentioned earlier, she grew up riding horses and was a lover of animals. And when they first came here in 1938, as my dad mentioned, they were draft horses. So the draft animals were pulling all the plows and rakes and doing the bulk of the labor. It was not a mechanized farm at that point in time. And Mrs. Bishop, as they had to enter the same entrance to the farm that you came through, and they would take the 2-mile drive down to their house, she would have to pass through the fields and see the animals being worked, and she just did not like that. And so she mentioned something to Mr. Bishop, and Mr. Bishop then in turn mentioned something to my grandfather and said, I think it's time for the horses to be retired and time for you to go and purchase a tractor. So Mr. Bishop always had accounts at different places. There was plenty of money, and so my grandfather went out and bought a 1939 Farmall Model A tractor, which then kind of mechanized the farm and retired the horses. But more than just loving horses, she had a favorite of squirrels, and I think
Squirrel.
I think I'll let Dad tell the
Or
squirrel.
maybe Torrey can
Or-
tell
Oh,
that.
no, let Bill tell.
Okay.
And I'll pass around some pictures of what the big house looked like on the inside,
Yeah.
so you can see what kind of life the Bishops lived.
In the main bedroom where Mr. and Mrs. Bishop had their beds and sofas, it was a huge bedroom, there was 2 squirrel cages. Now these things are about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. 2 squirrel cages in this beautiful room with beautiful carpeting, the kind of carpeting is special made just for that room. Okay, the outline goes around the fireplace areas and whatnot. Okay, so this is the one of a kind. To the chagrin of all the servants, she had squirrels in there and she didn't care. It was her squirrels, that's what she was going to have. Right off there was a walk-in closet. She had my dad convert it so the walk-in closet, which had a window, there was a trap door. The squirrels could come in from the outside into cages in the closet where they would be fed lots of peanuts. And my dad would take me and we'd go to Baltimore because there was a peanut roasting place in downtown Baltimore, and we'd buy 100-pound bags of raw peanuts every month to bring back. And 4:30 was feeding time.
4:30.
4:30.
You could see the squirrels jumping through the trees.
Yeah. Yeah, they just.
So you're the ones that did that.
Yeah. Right.
Mrs. Bishop did it.
Yeah. I mean, all those magnificent oak trees down there, you just see the squirrels just going from treetop to treetop, and at 4:30 we were throwing out buckets of, raw peanuts for them to eat. And in the fall, I would collect acorns, and then my dad would ship them down to Florida so Ms. Bishop could feed the squirrels down there acorns.
Wow.
But, that was just her
Got a
attitude.
question.
Yes.
I'm curious about as far as the dairy farm, and if there was a relationship between the Bishops and Robert Lee Forrest, who has the Java Dairy Farm, where Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is now located, which is off of Muddy Creek,
Right.
not that far from here, because it seems like it's a little bit sort of in the same time frame.
Yes.
Do you know if the Bishops had a relationship with Robert Lee Forrest, or before that?
I don't know factually, but I can almost guarantee you, no, he did not.
It would have been before the Bishops because they
Right.
immediately
stopped.
stopped the
Yeah.
farming because of their concern about animals.
Yeah.
The Java Farm Dairy was, I think, just 1915 to 45. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They used to supply the neighborhood,
Yeah. Yeah, I do know for one thing, because my dad, again, was caretaker prior to World War II. Mr. Bishop made sure that Dad was planting all the appropriate crops to supplement the federal government and the war effort, so that he would get a, what do you call it, where you don't have to serve.
Farm deferment.
Yeah, farm deferment. So my dad worked here on the farm during the World War II because of a farm deferment. But he had to raise X number of, acres of, whatever they needed. If it was peas and corn or string beans or whatever, that's what you raised for the government.
So that enabled, if I understand this right from Chris and Bill, what was wonderful about that is that the Bishops who had kept on all the farm hands, even though it wasn't a farm, because they were tremendously wealthy and because they were generous people, when the war came along, those folks would have been called up. So he called the Department of Agriculture, Chris, is it?
Yeah, as my grandmother told it, Mr. Bishop had connections, always had connections. And before my grandfather even knew what was really happening, Mr. Bishop had called people in the government, whether it was the Department of Agriculture, Defense, and basically volunteered, the use of the farm, and, got, those ratios of whether peas, corn, et cetera, that was to be planted in the farm deferments. Mr. Bishop also had a very large yacht, I think that was over 100 feet, that he donated for use during the war. I think it became like a coastal patrol type of boat.
Yeah.
I think when it came back, didn't it still have gun mounts on it? Or?
Yeah, they had ripped off all the torpedo tubes and machine guns. They had ripped all the stuff off the deck and said, "Mr. Bishop, here's your yacht back." And he said, "Nah, you keep it." And it was named the Lady Patty after his wife. Her nickname was Patty and his nickname was Ned.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we say he would bring his yacht up, we're talking, about a 113-foot yacht. One of the vessels he owned had belonged to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So boating was something, one of the pictures I passed around shows his office, and you can see a lot of the nautical stuff, on the wall there.
Bowden Pond isn't that deep. They couldn't have brought that 100-foot
No.
boat there, right?
No, the Lady Patty would either stay moored in Harness Creek, because as you come into Harness Creek, there used to be a large point there. There was a large house on that point, a two-story house. There was a road going down to it with piers and wharves. There even used to be a hitching post down there for hitching up horses, but there was structures there too. They're all long gone. You can still see some of the pilings, though, from the original piers. So he could either bring the Lady Patty into there, because that has about 18 to 20 feet of water right at that corner, or, when I was growing up, or he would keep it at the Annapolis Yacht Club, because he was a member of the Annapolis Yacht Club.
Yeah.
So another thing I'd like us to talk about, Frank, maybe you can kick off. I mean, this is a very fruitful area beyond what was grown here. When you all were living here or visiting, what did you hunt? Did you harvest oysters? Did you fish? What was your own kitchen garden like?
500 tomato plants.
What did your folks do?
Mainly it was a garden. Didn't do really any hunting around here. Fishing, as I said, I grew up on the water in Eastport, so I had friends of mine had boats. My wife grew up in Bay Ridge, so we had a boat down in Bay Ridge. So if we wanted to go out fishing, we would do that, go out to the Bay Bridge, go into Annapolis, go by where it was David Taylor. We'd go over there and do white perch fishing. And a good friend of mine that grew up 2 doors down from me in Eastport was the Stevens family that had the hardware store. And we would always have a white perch tournament. And we would have anywhere from 20 to 30 boats. Go out fishing, bring them back. And half the boats, we didn't know who the people were. They just word of mouth. And we did that quite a bit. And but as far as hunting here, there was not a whole lot going on. My brother-in-law had a garden that he maintained up by, I guess it's where the dog park is now. That was probably 150 by 200 that he planted all, vegetables and all that for Miss Parker and Mr. Young. And that was probably took up most of his time. And that's why he wanted me to come and help him cut the grass and do this, because he said, I've got to maintain the garden because it's a priority to Miss Parker. So that's why he spent quite a bit of time doing that.
Did he have to protect the garden from deer, or was the deer population just very low?
It was I guess it was pretty low, because he never really mentioned that he had to. He said on occasion he would see where an animal would come in there, but it wasn't enough to really deter, doing anything other than, maybe putting up, a small fence around certain plants and all that, but it really wasn't that much of a problem for him.
I can remember my dad planting a large field with, not field corn, but, human consumption type corn. And people would say, well, what's the problem? And Dad says, well, I plant that much corn because 1/3 goes to the deer, 1/3 goes to the raccoons, and the other 1/3 is for us.
They made allowances for it. When I was picking string beans down there one time at the garden, all of a sudden I realized there was a fawn right there. His mother had buried him within the string beans. I just let him go and backed off, said, I know Mama's here someplace. I'm getting away. But they were there a lot.
I was wondering, how many wells were there on this property?
They're everywhere.
About gardens and
They were
everything like
everywhere.
that, which everywhere, yeah.
Such as, I want to myself, down here where you had the old farm equipment, there were windmills. So you had a big water tower and a huge windmill on top. And that would supply water to the families down there. There was a couple of them over where the gardens, which is kind of halfway between the dog park and the gazebos, because there was the gardener's house there. There was a huge water tower. And then in-ground wells, there was one right, right in the field in front of the farmhouse. And we'd fill it in, and a couple years later, it kind of sink down, and we'd go fill it in again, and it sink down. So yeah, that was about halfway down the hill. So if you were sleigh riding and you went through the well, you knew what you were talking about.
There were also ice houses,
Yeah.
because they used to go out and get the ice off harness or out of the river. My father-in-law talked about putting the shoes on the horse, the ice shoes. There's little spikes on them, so they had traction on the ice, and they'd go out and cut the big ice and bring it to the ice house, so they always had ice.
And that was by the farmhouse?
No, it's right down. I'd have to take like a walking tour down one of the trails to really be able to show you. But there was an area there where the ice house is like mostly underground, and they put in straw and then blocks of ice, straw, blocks of ice, straw, blocks of ice, and stack it up until it was just above ground level. And it was covered over and all that. But that way you would have ice until, at least mid or late July, or June rather.
And what about, did you all go crabbing and?
Oh, tell them about oystering.
Oh, yes.
Clamming.
Clamming.
During the wintertime, we'd wait till the winds blew really strong out of, I guess it'd be the northeast or northwest, but the winds would blow strong for like a day, blow all the water out of the river, as my dad would say. They'd blow it all over to the eastern shore. Well, in front of the big house, that was all flats, and where the gazebos are now, that would be all flats. There would be no water, it'd just be mud. And we'd go out there with our boots and a basket and shovels, and we would dig up mannows, or soft-shell clams, or what you call squirters. And within a half an hour, you could fill a half a bushel basket, which is a lot of soft-shell clams. But yeah, they were right there just for the taking. Dad would say, oh, you see all those bubbles right there? Just start digging where you see all those little bubbles coming up out of the mud.
And that was at the gazebo overlook you're
Yeah,
talking about?
Yep.
So right by Aberdeen Creek and
Yeah.
Crab Creek, or Crab Creek, I guess.
Yeah, closer up towards Loden Pond. Because if I remember right, because the farm, we think of it as being one great big entity. The section of farm that we're in right now was owned by, technically, Simplicity Land Company. Guess who owned Simplicity Land Company?
Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop. And then the area that was just most recently purchased, which was the residential area, which was, I think, 33 acres, that included Loden Pond. So that way he'd get a tax write-off from the farmland, and then only a smaller portion was actually residential. So there was two different tax brackets.
The boathouse there still, right?
Yeah.
Boathouse is still there.
Yeah.
Well, it's
I'll pass it around.
not for long.
That's the boathouse.
Yeah. Since you mentioned the boathouse, a picture of it in its glory days.
Oh, the little one? That was the guest house. And the guest house had 2 bedrooms, I think.
Yes.
And a bathroom, no kitchen, because they were guests.
Yeah.
And
And immediately next to it.
was the big house.
Right.
And that, if you would have gone past the little house and down, that's where the boathouse, but it going out and towards the river.
The big house, there's still a satellite dish out there.
Oh, is there?
In the ground, like over the.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's still a satellite dish, that's good. Yeah, I think it was about 1958 or 59, air conditioning units were just coming out to the public. So Mr. Bishop called my dad up and said, you know what, I think it'd be a good idea to get some air conditioning. So he said, get about 10 or 12 air conditioners to put in the big house, put a few in the guest house, and he said, well, yeah, pick yourself up one and put it in, and put it in the farmhouse for yourselves too. That's, okay, I mean, it was nothing to it, just, get a dozen or so air conditioning units. But that's his generosity of thinking about, the people who are living on the farm, we take care of them. Dad had to kind of converge the farm over from dairy to what we call truck farming. That's your produce, your string beans, your peas, your squash, your tomatoes and whatnot, especially because World War II forced him into it. But after that, as Chris was mentioning, the bishops and everybody else depended upon a lot of those vegetables to sustain them through the rest of the summer and into the fall. So,
He also sold some of that produce to places in town.
Cookies, was cookies back then?
Yes.
yes. Yeah, Dad would put all the vegetables load in the back of the truck up, and he'd go around to some of the local dealerships like Marvin Motors on West Street, Rodowski's in Eastport, because Rodowski's was primarily a grocery store. And Mr. Rodowski would come out there and look at them and make sure that there were good tomatoes on the bottom of the basket as well as the top. Yeah, but yeah, just sell produce right out of the back of the truck. But yeah, we have very close ties, to Eastport. As a teenager, I used to ride my bicycle down through Highland Beach because it was new, it was different. Highland Beach was always a nice place to ride your bicycles around. So, Eastport, I had relatives that grew up in Eastport as well. I don't know where Frank's family was from. Like you mentioned, the street in Eastport. I had an uncle living on First Street. So, we were all, quite local. Bay Ridge was, familiar tromping grounds, Annapolis roads.
And maybe we'll finish up by talking about what was it like in the broader Annapolis Neck community growing up. You were telling me where you had to go to grocery shop back in the early, when it was down by City Dock, is that right? When you were a kid, you had to go all the way down there to the grocery?
Yeah, there was an Acme, I think it was AMP. AMP, yeah, that was the main grocery store right there. I guess, was it the Harbor Houses, where the old Acme building was? Yeah. And then eventually Eastport got Safeway, so that was a really big deal.
That was a big thing.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
That's a ways to go, given what's around here now.
So everybody in Bay Ridge, Annapolis Roads, the Highland Beach area and whatnot, yeah, that was a big deal for groceries. But, you were out on the peninsula. I'm sorry?
What year did the bishops die?
Mr. Bishop passed away probably about 58 or 59. I don't recall exactly.
Mrs. Bishop died in 72.
72?
Right. Yeah.
So,
This Safeway was where the Eastport Shopping Center is?
Yes.
now?
Right. That was the anchor store there.
Where the gym, I think it's a gym now.
It's a gym, yeah.
Right.
That was a Safeway.
Yeah.
and where did you go to school growing up?
Eastport Elementary.
Eastport Elementary.
Yeah.
Yeah? So, now we've got Georgetown and
Right.
Hillsmere, and it was a different day.
It was a different day. Bill's mother, always amazing. She grew up on Brewer Avenue, which is,
Off of West Street, right across from Brewer Cemetery.
and she and her brother would walk to Annapolis Elementary from there. And they'd walk to school, then they'd walk home for lunch because they didn't serve lunch. Then they walked back, and then they walked home. So it was a lot of, people walked, and there's a Now and Again Annapolis book over there on the table. Bill's mom wrote little notes in it. Came out from 1900s to 1960s, I think, Annapolis. And she would write, this is my aunt and all those little things. So it gives you an idea of what things were like in those days. But it was interesting.
When I was growing up, Main Street in Annapolis and West Street, they were the shopping hubs. If you wanted shoes, clothing, if you wanted stuff for the house, you went to H.B. Myers, but everything was downtown, right around Church Circle on Main Street. So when these outlying places came up, oh my God, there was quite an uproar. Pearl Shopping Center started getting developed. That was quite an uproar. All the business was going to leave Annapolis. But it worked. But Annapolis was a fun place to live in those days because everybody, that's where you went to do your shopping and see other people.
And everybody knew everybody.
To this day, everybody knows everybody.
Yes.
You don't talk negative about anybody because they know somebody that knows them. So.
Yeah, and Chris, maybe then you could tell us, it's a great way to finish before our next talk comes on, how there were the Busers, the Dulaneys, the Mitchells, and y'all are related.
Yeah, so it turns out it really is a family affair. And so my grandmother, Margaret, who we've mentioned a number of times, her family were the Mitchells. And so Karen Mitchell, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, she grew up here on the farm as the niece of Frank. But we all descend from a common relative. And so Philip Mitchell, who was a waterman here in Annapolis, he served as a Union soldier during the Civil War, was down in Virginia, was at Antietam, and is now buried at the National Cemetery right out there on West Street, right by the traffic circle. But he is my great-great-grandfather, and he is the common relative for all of us and how we are all connected here. So, it's just kind of an interesting thing. We talk about Annapolis being a small town. Don't say anything bad, you might be my cousin.
Yeah. Don't say anything bad about that Frank Dulaney guy, 'cause you never know, you might know this guy.
And he was in the Oyster Navy?
He was, so he and his brother, after the Civil War, they were in what was called the Oyster Navy, is a forerunner of the Department of Natural Resources. There were a lot of commercial boats that would come out of Baltimore and come down to the Thomas Point Shoal area, and they would try and do dredging, which was something that would really tear up the river and make it very difficult for animals to, the water to come back. And so they were there to defend it and make sure only the people who had proper permits doing tonging would be there. And so he had a small cannon on the front of his boat, fired a 2-inch ball, and they would have rifles and they would chase these boats off. There is a great book about Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse and its history, and if you search for some old Baltimore Sun articles, you can find some of their exploits. They didn't always miss, but it was a different era and a different time, and it was kind of like the old Wild West out there on the South River in Thomas Point, chasing away the illegal oystermen. So.
And their common ancestor actually didn't miss.
No, he didn't miss. They did kill 2 on different occasions. So it was a different era, different time, I guess. But they had some fun times out there. There's also some more interesting stories in the news about how one time they caught a shark out in their gill nets right outside on the Severn River, caught an 8-foot bull shark. And they drug it back into the pier at Annapolis, and they were charging people like a nickel to come and see the great shark that they had caught out there in Annapolis. So, just different things.
Did the river freeze up? Did you go ice skating on that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Often? I mean, did it freeze up like annually?
Yes.
Yeah, the river would freeze over probably at least every other year. You get a hard freeze.
There was time in the 70s that it all froze and people were driving their cars out on the river.
I was one of them.
Yeah,
the South River.
That Volkswagen?
Yellow
Volkswagen.
You were
There
the
were
one.
I was
pictures
the
in
one,
the
yeah.
paper.
That was my picture.
I thought I saw you in the
That was
paper.
it was me.
Yeah. But
Well, everyone, I'm sure you'll agree this is an incredible glimpse into the farm in Annapolis Neck and Annapolis history. Please give our panel a hand.